Typography is so much more than choosing a beautiful font, and in today's video, I'm going to explain to you why. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Welcome to another episode of Wine and Design, where we get together every Wednesday with our favorite beverage and talk about graphic design. I'm so excited for today's video. I'm going to be talking about typography, which is a huge, important part of branding and websites. So I'm going to give you guys all my tips on how to pair fonts and what to really think about when looking at typography. So let's jump right in. So I want to start off by explaining the difference between serif and sans serif fonts. These are typically the most commonly talked about. If you're on any font website, you'll probably see those two to categorize from. And they're kind of like the standard of fonts, so I wanted to explain the difference. Serif fonts are the fonts that you see with the little accents and little lines that come off of the letters, typically seen in books. Sans serif font is exactly what it sounds like. Sans means without, so sans serif font is fonts without those little accents on those letters. Super easy way to remember. Sans is without, serif is with. And if you are curious on the history of serif fonts, I did look it up when I was researching for this video, and it's kind of interesting that actually originated, what they believe, is from the Latin alphabet. When they used to carve letters into stone, they would see those accents on those letters, so that is where serif possibly originated from. Now, besides those two main fonts that we typically hear about, there's also a font called slab serif. Now, this is similar to serif fonts, but these are typically more straight-lined letters and really bold or thick. So that is also one to keep in mind. Of course, we have our script fonts, which are more of the handwritten calligraphy style, just like very scripted fonts, just as it sounds, and we will definitely talk about that later on in the video. Those are the main fonts I want us to keep in mind throughout this video, and the descriptions of each of those. As you are on your own font search journey, you'll definitely see those names pop up a lot. So my first tip when it comes to pairing your fonts is to actually try out pairing sans serif and serif fonts together. Now, I know a lot of times people might think that pairing fonts that are really similar is a good thing to do, and that can look really nice. It's all dependent on the branding, but typically having a sans serif font with a serif font can look really nice. Now, I will say though, to keep in mind that having similar qualities within those fonts is really going to help it make it look eye-catching and really clean. So I'll have some examples of fonts that have similar qualities but are different in their categories. But having that serif font as a header and the sans serif font as the body, in my experience, it looks really nice and really good. So I would try that out on your own and see kind of how those pairing ideas with those different categories can really work nicely. Also, in my experience, having a really bold, more of that slab serif font as the heading font or as the main word in the logo, and more of a thin font or even a decorative font as the subline of text or the subheading text or the tagline or maybe the established by, having the bold and the thinner font can look really nice together. And as the designers, we are the ones guiding people on what to look at. And it's kind of crazy how just one simple choice of a font can change the perspective of what people are seeing. So I, in my experience, have used a lot of bold fonts, that scared me, bold fonts for the heading and thinner fonts for the subheading, and that always looks really nice too. Leo's gonna join us for the rest of the video, I guess. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is kerning and tracking. This might be a terminology that you have never really heard of. I feel like I tend to forget on which one is which, but I'm going to explain to it right now so we can all remember. Kerning is the spacing between the individual letters, and tracking is the spacing vertically between the lines of text. So kerning is space between letters, tracking is lines between text. So I like to make sure that the kerning and tracking is similar, especially on websites. You don't want to have like a super spaced out paragraph and then another paragraph that's really tight and like close together. So making sure that the tracking is similar across the website is really important, and across the branding. Have had the subline of text or the subheading text really spaced out to match the length of text the length of the word from the heading text. Now this is really all dependent on the brand and the word and the brand name and everything that goes into it, but I definitely love the look of kerning those letters that are underneath the heading text to match the length so they look really symmetrical and really even. Now this next tip is more of an intuitive tip, and I feel like font pairing in general and choosing fonts is a really intuitive part of the design process. We're using a lot of our feelings and moods when we look at those fonts and like how we feel when we look at them. But this tip is really to keep that in mind and listen to your gut feelings when you see a specific font and it makes you feel more playful. Maybe it's a more childish feeling. Maybe it's more handwritten and organic. There's also those fonts that look stamped. They look really like vintage. So there's definitely fonts that have an overall vibe to it, overall feeling to it. And this is one of the hardest things to explain because it's really just how you feel when you look at it. But I would say make sure that you listen to those feelings and pair fonts together that have similar vibes. That's really vague. It really does help when I started thinking that way. I was like, okay, this is a vintage font, so I would not want to pair a vintage font with like a really modern, straight cut, like really basic font. I'd want it to look organic and vintage all together. I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about script fonts. Now script fonts, I definitely am not against them. Tread lightly here though, because script fonts can be very difficult to read sometimes, and to be honest, they're just not very scalable. If you have a script font in a logo, you have to think about how that's going to look when it's really small in the minimum size it will be compared to when it's like the biggest size it will be. I think sometimes it gets hard to understand that it needs to be scalable when we're looking at like Adobe Illustrator or at our screen zoomed in. So definitely keep that in mind. If you are deciding to use a script font, make sure that it can be scaled down and scaled up and still be legible. But I do like script fonts here and there. I think that if you do use a script font, it should just be like an accent font that you use very minimally. Maybe it's just like one line of text on the logo or like a simple word on the logo. I actually just did one, I'll pop one right here, recently that I felt like the script actually flowed well with it. But I don't like to use it very commonly, especially not very commonly on the website, because it can look just really, it can look really messy really quickly. I think that's what I'm trying to explain. If you have script font as the body font, it can look like a lot. So I personally like very minimal touches of script, and I do recommend practicing that to start off with. My next tip is to make sure that you're not using fonts that are identical to each other, that look really, really similar. You do want to have that differentiation. You want to have that separation between the heading font and the subheading font, or the heading font and the body font. You want them to look different and not exactly the same. That's one of the last things you should do, is have them identical. It is different weight and different boldness that you can implement if you wanted to have like a bold version of the font and a thinner font in the same font family. That is possible and that could look really good, but I do like to have that kind of separation from the two to give the brand some more depth and to also have those two very separate. I feel like I said that 3 times, but have them look different to each other, but also similar qualities, if that makes sense. But don't have them identical, and I'll show you examples of why it just doesn't look very good or very exciting or very eye-catching. Now, along with that tip, you don't want to have fonts that are extremely opposite of each other. If you have like a bold serif font and then another font that's like decorative and also serif, it's just gonna look really jumbled and not like they go well together. So try and find fonts, like I've mentioned a million times in this video, that have similar qualities but different, and this is just so intuitive, but the more you practice and the more you look at them, you'll know exactly what I mean. Okay, my next tip is to remember that 3 fonts is most commonly key. I feel like it can get really overwhelming and also really exciting because fonts are so fun. They're fun to look for, they're fun to implement, they're fun to manipulate. But remember that 3 fonts is typically all you really need. A heading font, body font, and subheading font, or you can do a heading font, use that same heading font as a subheading and just have a different body font, and then maybe like an accent font that you use minimally. So just remember, 3 is key. Do not go crazy with it. Try not to have so many fonts that the brand is just confusing and looks like a million different brands in one. Try to just keep it to 3 and have them very similar qualities, really pair nicely, eye-catching, and match the overall voice and feeling that you're trying to give the brand. So if it's a very luxurious modern brand, you might want to use more maybe sans serif fonts, more straight line, very like easy to read fonts that are clean, minimal, and match that overall branding. But just keep in mind, 3 is key. You don't need to go above that. If you do go above that, just make sure you're keeping in mind that it looks similar to each other and it doesn't look like a completely different brand. I recently heard about this tip and I'm gonna give it to you guys because it actually did kind of help me, and it's math, which I cannot believe I'm gonna be doing math with you guys right now. It's a quick little tip, but what I would recommend if you are coming up with the sizing of your fonts, especially for websites, to keep in mind that the body font, I'm give you guys examples of what I use for the sizing. For the body font, I typically do like 14 to 18 point. I like to make sure it's legible, and I really take into account the target audience. If they're maybe an older crowd, we definitely want the font to be bigger and really easy to read. And the heading font, we also want that to be differentiated. Oh my god, I keep using that word. We want it to look different than the body font and bigger, clearly. So what I recommend doing is using this equation. Really helps, but let's say that my body font is 18 point, and we can do the math together. So let's say my body font's 18 point. We are going to times that by 1.618. So times 1.618 by 18, and we get 29. So we're going to round that up, which will be 30. So we can make our subheading font, let's say 30. So 30 point for the subheading. Now let's figure out the heading fonts. Like these are H1, H2, H3, just in case if you're confused on subheading versus heading. 8, you can round that up, you can keep it the same, you can be 48 or 49, but that's actually perfect. Every time I use this equation, it ends up being perfect sizing and it looks really consistent and it looks really easy to read. So 48 for heading, 30 for subheading, and 18 for body. Perfect. So try that equation out. I know, I cannot believe I just did math. I'm not good at numbers, but that does help me, and for some reason it makes sense in my brain. Okay, you guys, I wanted to give you one last tip and one last resource if you are interested in learning more about logos and fonts and all the things that go into it. I do have a freebie right now that you can get your hands on. I have it linked right down below, and this actually will give you a good idea and see visually some examples of fonts or logos that are using the fonts I just mentioned. So this freebie goes into 5 different types of logo designs, and it explains the overall feeling and gives examples of logos within each one of these descriptions. So definitely go check that out. I'll have a link down below. Let me know if you guys like it, if you learned anything from this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I love talking about typography. It's so fun, and I hope you guys also enjoyed this. But thank you so much, and I will see you guys in my next video.